your host, Bill Reel.
Welcome to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I'm your host, Bill Reel, and grateful for this chance to spend time with you. The Almost Awakened podcast is where we spend this time together exploring community and podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. I know I actually am awakened, so I might be on the wrong podcast. This is for people that are almost awakened.
This is for folks
I'm like way
almost
beyond.
So you're woke.
No, I hate that word.
Yeah, so do I.
Woke.
So do I. If there's a negative connotation in our culture, it's almost like, you think you're woke. And the reality is, I think all of us in this space know that we can't even begin to really capture what it is that we're going to talk about today, but we're going to talk about it anyway. You and I are talking, Glenn. You're a friend of mine. I know you at least well enough to call you an acquaintance. And we've talked a few times in interviews and other podcasts. We've had conversations in person at a conference or two.
And you invited me to parties up in St. George that I wish I would have gone to.
You should have. You would have been
just
more
like
woke.
7 hours away. Yeah.
Right.
You would have been more woke.
You'd have been more woke. The reason we're talking today, you've just put out some, what I think is fantastic material, a book. There's an audio version on iTunes, which I've been listening to, but you also have a physical, PDF people can get, or an online,
an actual real paperback book.
Yeah. More trees dead.
Yeah. Right.
And the book is titled Bathing with God. And when you first sent it to me and I started listening, I fell in love with it immediately. Episode 1, which was kind of a pretext to dive into what you were going to talk about. And I want to talk about a lot of things, and I'll just throw a few things out. We'll just kind of go back and forth, because I think this is going to be good ground for you and I just to kind of just riff on. But this idea that everything is fiction, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, by the way, everything is myth. The money we use, the stories we tell about our nation, the stories we tell about its founders, religions, political narratives, relationships, including, I even was talking before we started recording, my relationship with my wife is a myth. My relationship with my friends are myths. Talk for a moment about everything is fiction.
Yeah, it's a tricky idea, because the biggest pushback is people will say, well, I had this thing actually happen to me in my real life. You're saying that it's not a fiction, or you're saying that it's a fiction, that it isn't real? Like, no, that's not what I mean when I say that things are a myth or things are fiction. I don't mean that it's not real. It is real. It's just like it's a sliver of reality. It's not the whole of reality. It's one perspective, and it's a perspective that is coming in through your physical senses, which are limited. We're only getting like a fraction of what's actually going on. It's being filtered through our minds that have all of these beliefs and expectations about what the world is. And if you understand what confirmation bias is, you know that confirmation bias really determines what our reality is. It's playful. It's a playful suggestion to say that everything is a fiction. But what I want to do with it is to get myself, more than anybody else, but other people as well, but to get myself on a level playing field with other people, so that I don't think that my fictions are somehow superior to other people's fictions, or that my fictions are truths with a capital T and your fictions are fictions, because I was part of that religion for a long time and decided, that's not really where I want to be.
Yeah, I've got a goal in this podcast, not just this episode, but all of them for the most part. And I do break the rules sometimes, but I don't even want to mention the name of that religion. I want to stay away from that. So,
you're excommunicating that religion from you?
Right, exactly. Right. I've excommunicated it. Right. But let's be honest. Okay, so I'm trying to drag you into a fight here. Let's be honest. Okay. Some truths are more useful, are they not? Like some narratives cause harm and trauma. And you and I, at various parts in our life, have pointed to those narratives and said that narrative is less useful than other narratives, and people should steer clear of it. So I feel like when you say that, I've noticed this movement in you, and to come to a place and say like what makes one truth more important than another or better than another, maybe talk about how you hash that out when you and I both know that some narratives do cause more harm than other narratives. What is the shift, and what are you trying to say in terms of maybe all truths, maybe all things are untrue in some ways, other things are true in some ways, and yet how do we decide the value of those things?
Well, I don't know that I agree that there's narratives that are harmful. Maybe. I mean, I think you can't really separate a narrative from the person who is telling the narrative or using the narrative as a way to justify whatever it is that they're doing. I think that it's the motivations of people and the actions of people towards other people that can be harmful. And they'll use narratives as a way to justify that. But I don't know that the narrative in and of itself is necessarily a bad thing. Like if you're talking about a certain church that shall not be named, like the Church of Voldemort, there might be certain narratives that that church has that we could look at and point and go, oh yeah, that's harmful, that's damaging. But it's really the way that those narratives get used by people against other people where the damage happens. So I think it's more of somebody who's not woke, somebody who's not awakened, somebody who doesn't recognize that in as much as you've done it unto the least of these, my brother, and you've done it unto me, people who don't recognize that that's actually true and real, even though that also is a fiction. So like when I say fiction, I don't mean something that isn't true. I don't mean something that isn't real. I just mean it's one particular perspective that you're focusing on and you're ignoring other things. So I don't know. Does that address your question, Bill? I kind of went a little crazy on it.
So if I compare, let me compare Scientology, which is one extreme, and then let's compare Buddhism. Okay. And you're saying that in spite of some of the guidelines, or in some instances, in some of these high demand fundamentalist religions, the canonical verses. So if I were to take the Old Testament, for instance, and it says, if you rape a woman, go to her father and pay him, 30 shekels, and now she's given unto you in marriage. That seems deeply harmful. That seems like something that if I'm going to take a religion.
Never heard that one before.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact, but there is where the rapist has to marry the victim has to marry her rapist, and of course every woman wants to do that. And so there are verses of Scripture. And there are groups of people who use those verses of Scripture to impose on others very unhealthy dynamics that lead to trauma. And trauma is real. And let's, trauma is inescapable. All of us receive trauma throughout our life. And that trauma, to some degree, is even passed down in our DNA to those, our descendants. But I know you well enough to know that at least in points in your life, you would have saw differences in value between systems that were healthier or unhealthier than others. If I compare like these horrible scriptural verses that do cause harm and compare it to religions such as, say, Buddhism, where it's a much gentler, learn to kind of sit with yourself, learn to kind of be present. You're saying like there's not a difference in value. It really is how these verses are used, even if the verse itself is damaging.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about the different sects of Buddhism, but I would expect that just because human nature is so what it is, that there would be sects of Buddhism that would be more kind of pharisaical and critical of themselves and other people than other sects of Buddhism. That they might interpret those teachings of Buddha from a very like fear-based, or like these things are wrong with the world, or this is what's wrong with you, and this is what and I think that's more like what you see with the Pharisees in the New Testament, and that's more of like a human thing, that way of approaching reality, or that way of approaching from a place of fear and from a place of really wanting to think of yourself as being superior in comparison to other people. And I think that's missing a lot. But I don't know. Is that, I don't think that that's in the texts themselves, in the narrative themselves. I think it's more in the minds and the hearts of the people who use those scriptures as a way to justify their own fear, to justify their own, whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah, I think you're certainly pointing us to, there is this idea that as you become awakened, it's really easy to maybe think of yourself as, again, woke or developed or ahead of the game. And you can look back at others and begin to judge others as being kind of, ignorant or naive.
Not woke.
Or yeah. And so there's an easy way to go like, oh, I'm further ahead than them and they're further behind, and they should look at more development and read more books by Alan Watts and get to where I'm at. But I think you're pointing to this idea that we really are all on this equal ground and we all have equal value. And I'm going to address that in one of the questions later on as I'm having the conversation. But I think it's important. I think you're raising kind of this awareness that humans are an extension, and you say this in the book, the extension of the creativity of the universe. We really are an outflow of that. and that each human being really is precious. Every human being has a perspective that's never been had before on planet Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. And that every human being is also the same divine. And I use the word divine. I mean, divine can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but that we are this energy, this one energy. And I guess I'd be curious to know for you, what does it mean to be awakened? And I'll tell you for me what it means to be awakened. What it means for me to be awakened is to recognize that in every atom of my body, there's this subatomic energy that was forged in the stars that is indestructible. And I'm going to say that that has the same characteristics that are normally associated with God or divinity, that it's omniscient, it's omnipotent, it's omnipresent. And the reason I think that this energy is omniscient is because it knows, and I kind of put that word in quotation marks because it's anthropomorphizing the energy, but it knows how to be everything that it is. And it is everything that we see and experience in the world around us. And plus everything on the other side of the universe that we don't have any sense of, like we don't really know, but we know that this energy is everything that's in the universe. And so it's omniscient. It knows how to be that. It's omnipotent because it has the power to become it, and it is it. And it's omnipresent because it's everywhere. It's manifesting itself as you, and as every cell in your body, and as every cell in a flower, and as every cell in a piece of plastic. And, everything everywhere is what this energy is. And recognizing that I'm that and you're that and everything is that, to me, is what it means to be awakened to the truth of reality. And that there's this illusion that I'm a separate self, that I'm a separate identity, and that I can be threatened, that my identity could be threatened, that there's death that could kill me, and then I would cease to exist. But we don't really know what the experience of this energy is in any other form than what we are right here and right now. And so to me, like being awakened is like being open to the possibility of everything that this energy could be based on what we know what it is in the here and now.
One of the things of being almost awakened is I've become very interested in trying to understand as much as I can as a human being about evolution and about what brought us to this moment and why we react and respond to others and situations the way we do. And one of the things that is interesting about this creative force in the universe, which in the book you're calling God, and I think I know what you mean, and I want to ask you that later here too, but that creative force is intelligent in that it has shown up in billions and billions and probably, infinite number of manifestations. Trees, dogs, Cro-Magnon man, like whatever the planet is doing in its moment, all of life, which comes from that source, evolves and adapts or dies off. And so this creative force that you're saying is intelligent seems to have the ability to recreate itself in various forms, and those forms tend to do well at various times in the planet's history. Like this force is adaptable, which is what I think we mean by evolution, and that all of these life forms come from that same source, right?
And so does, so the way that I understand evolution is that there's an environment that provides challenges and hostility, and life either succumbs to that hostility or it, mutates and evolves to overcome that hostility. And it's like this dance that the environment does with these different forms of life. And then you've got survival of the fittest. But this energy is both the environment and the life that's evolving. So it's providing the hostility of the environment is a reaction and response to the life that is in it. So like when we talk about global warming and things that we're doing to the environment, we're creating an environment where there's hostility that life is going to respond to and evolve to. And is that in the form of Homo sapien, or will there be some other form of life that are we going to create this environment that's so hostile that we wipe out the human race, and then life kind of starts over and evolves until you've got a form of life that really thrives in a hotter climate, or whatever, and the intelligence that is in that energy, in that species of life that's evolving, then eventually gets to the point where humans are, It's stepping back and it's looking at life as something that's bigger than the human species. I do that a lot in the book with this imaginary character called Quad, who is either the voice of God or the imagination of the guy that's bathing, this atheist that's bathing. But it's those kinds of questions that I'm exploring, that really sprung out of this religion that shall not be named, where there was a founder who I think did a lot of this kind of stuff, like trying to understand what is the nature of God. Oh, God was intelligence that has been evolving throughout the eternities, and that is what we are, and that's what we're evolving towards. And all of that stuff is really still quite interesting to me, but trying to do it in a way that reconciles what we know of science instead of going against science. And so like looking at quantum mechanics, things like that seem to be consistent with this idea of a single energy field that fills the entire universe, that is manifesting itself as all of the different things that we see, and we're one of them. And one of the things that this energy is doing is creating this ego, this radar system that we have in our minds, where we're scanning the environment with our physical senses, and that's how we identify. We think that we're this thing that is the ego, but we're really the energy that makes us up and is doing the ego and is doing all of the other things that we don't even think about, like growing our hair and coloring our eyes and beating our heart and doing all these other things.
Yeah, I just saw an article the other day where a physicist was positing that the entire universe might be a neural network, and I find that to be fascinating, right in line with kind of the conversation we're having.
Yeah. And Alan Watts talks about that too, as like networks of communication and how we're different like synapses that are firing in the brain of God or whatever you want to call it, like in the universe, this network of communication.
Right. What was the impetus for writing the book? Like what brought you to a place where you're like, look, I think I've got an idea here and I'd like to put this down, and so people can hear this, I think, fictional conversation, but also real conversation that you and all the other folks who are swimming in the space that we're having with ourselves inside our head. What got you to the point to produce the book?
I've always wanted to write a book, and so doing Infants on Thrones and exploring the kinds of things the last several years that I've been interested in. I've moved away from kind of the just looking at church things and bashing the church, and looking more at a larger questions of what is truth and what is fiction. And I explored something like, do you know who Abraham Hicks is? Like I did some episodes for Infants on Thrones on Abraham Hicks. So it's this woman named Esther Hicks that channels this intelligence, this personality that she calls Abraham, that my interpretation of it is that she's playing a game, and that it's her imagination that's using this character of Abraham to say, what would the source energy that makes up everything that exists say if it was asked this question? And so Esther Hicks has been doing this Abraham Hicks thing since, I don't know, the mid to late 80s. You can YouTube it and find some things about her. But I did some episodes on Infants on Thrones around Abraham Hicks. There was a book called Seth Speaks that is a woman named Jane Roberts who is channeling this personality called Seth, which is, again, it just seems like it's an imaginary way of trying to explore what existence might look like from a non-human perspective, or from an energy that comes in and is reincarnated life after life, but has moved on past the planet. And I don't know, Seth Speaks is really interesting. So I was listening to this stuff, and I was kind of turned on by it, and I thought, well, why not take a stab at it? And so I started doing, a couple of years ago, I did these episodes on Infants on Thrones called Conversations with Quad. And it was kind of a nod to, what's the guy's name? He wrote the book, Neil Donald Walsh, I think is his name, that wrote Conversations with God. And a friend of mine recommended that to me, and I listened to a little bit of it, and I didn't really like it. It was a little bit too Christian for my sensibilities, and the exchange between the guy and the God were a little like he was lobbing softballs to me. I just didn't really like it. So I thought, how would I do it? So I got in a bathtub and I pulled out my phone and I started writing, and I liked what I was writing. I just kind of created this character of Quad, who is my own imagination, or the imagination of this atheist bather, and started posing these questions to him, and like, how would I answer this? if I was the energy that really animates all things, or at least I'm imagining what that would be like. So that was the impetus. It started a couple of years ago, and I did a couple of episodes on Infants on Thrones about it. And then I thought, I could keep doing it because I kept writing, and I just wasn't publishing it on the podcast. So I thought I'll turn it into a book and put it out there and see what kind of a response comes. And then I had the idea of doing that as a separate standalone podcast that includes not only chapters of the book, but also questions that come from listeners, trying to attract people who are interested in these kinds of things, because I started recognizing that most of the listeners of Infants on Thrones didn't seem to be as interested in this type of discussion as they were in earlier incarnations of Infants on Thrones, when we were just like bashing the church and doing smackdowns of stuff that was put on LDS.org and things like that. I was interested in kind of more of these transcendental, introspective ideas about the nature of reality and existence. And so I wrote the book and published it about a month ago, and I'm still kind of gauging what the response is to it.
I'm loving it. I think I've listened to 9 episodes at this point, and I really love the conversation that you're having essentially with yourself in this. But the best I can say is this awakened space. And again, we're talking about this creative force as God. So let's ask it here. I really, that word comes with so much baggage, because God, to at least most of the Western world, is this idea of this conscious, anthropomorphic, bearded man. But even if we assign a different gender or no gender, it's this being in the sky who watches all things and answers our prayers and helps us to have the things that we need to get by, and gives us challenges and blesses us with miracles. But what you seem to be speaking to, and I can get behind this, and I wonder if at some point we humans have to create a new word to describe it because of the baggage that the word God has. But if we believe in the Big Bang, there's this moment where, again, I'm going off just YouTube videos of other people smarter than me explaining it, but it was just, a speck and maybe smaller. And this Big Bang happens, and now this universe that we're in is actually expanding quicker and quicker. Some scientists used to think that it would slow down. It actually seems to be speeding up. Yeah. It is expanding and moving further and further out. It is the origination of all that is, the planets, and at least for this planet, the life that's on it. And if we go back far enough, if we, I find my father, and my father, finds his father, and we go back all the way past Homo sapiens, we get into other humanoid species, and then before that, we're something else. And at some point, we're the algae in the ocean billions of years ago, surrounding Pangea. Yeah. And there really is a creative force that we emanated from, but I struggle with whether we assign consciousness to it, which I don't think we do, and at least I don't. But there is an intelligence to it, even if it's unaware of its own intelligence. Talk for a moment about what you mean by God, and maybe we can go no further than that in terms of how we define it. But what do you mean by God?
Well, the way that I'm thinking of God, in Bathing with God, really, I have to acknowledge Richard Dawkins, of all people, because Richard Dawkins did an interview with Ben Stein years ago. Ben Stein did a documentary on intelligent design, and I watched it, and I was really frustrated with it. But there's this segment where Ben Stein brings in Richard Dawkins, and he's trying to pin him down on, well, how was all this made? Who created the world? Who created man? And Richard Dawkins' response was, why do you use the word who? You're begging the question when you use the word who. If you're talking about intelligent design and you're asking me, would there be any evidence, or what kind of evidence would I expect to see if there were some kind of intelligent design behind creation? It's possible that in some remote corner of the universe, there was a civilization that evolved to advanced technologies that were able to create life, and went and seeded life throughout the universe. And maybe they seeded life onto this planet, and we might be able to find some kind of a signature of that creator in the DNA. This is all what Richard Dawkins is saying to Ben Stein. And he says, but that intelligence itself, that advanced civilization, we might look at it as God, but they would have had to have evolved to that place over, eons of time through some kind of Darwinian means. They couldn't have just popped into that, and it couldn't be the creator of itself. And so I started thinking about that in those terms, because that made a lot of sense to me. And of course, growing up with a tradition that says that there is something called eternal progression, where that seems like evolution to me. That seems like evolution of spirit, evolution of intelligence, that in the beginning there is intelligence, and the intelligence begat more intelligence and evolved and evolved and evolved and evolved. That seemed like it was a consistent idea to me. And so when I talk about God, what I'm talking about is an intelligence that evolved to the point of being able to withstand any hostile environment that could ever exist anywhere, even in the vacuum of space. And where might we find that in what we understand of the world today? It seemed to me that in the quantum energy that is potential, that could be anything. And there's the quantum entanglement and, like all the stuff that we're starting to understand about quantum energy, that might be where you would see it. So why couldn't you think of, when life starts to evolve on the planet Earth in the form of single cells? How long ago was that? 4.8 million? I don't know how many years ago, billion years ago, however long ago that was, evolving to the point where it is now. That's just energy. It's just energy that's manifesting itself in different forms. And, each of the trillions of cells in our bodies are living organisms unto themselves. And they have a sense of awareness about the environment around them. And they're doing certain things. They have functions as living things. And they used to exist before they evolved and before they learned how to come together and form the kind of communities that now our nervous systems and circulatory systems and respiratory systems and digestive systems and all of the things that make us what we are as a human being. They're still these individual cells, and they went through this long process of evolution. I don't think that there's like a guiding intelligence that is making things happen a certain way, but that this energy that's doing this is aware of what it's doing, that it kind of records it in certain ways. So what are the characteristics of God? When people talk about God, they talk about God as being omniscient. They talk about God as being omnipotent. They talk about God as being omnipresent. They talk about God as being the creator of all things. This energy is all of those things. So why not call that God? And instead of thinking of God as being this bearded man in the sky that's like a Santa Claus that's keeping track of everybody, is going to see if you're naughty or nice, and it's going to punish you or it's going to reward you, that instead what this God is doing, and this came from Alan Watts, when I started listening to Alan Watts, he started talking about the game of hide and seek, and this idea coming out of Hinduism with Brahman, which is the energy that fills the entire universe, and then Atman, which is all of the individual ways that the energy expresses itself as you and me and different individual characteristics. That made a lot of sense to me as what would an advanced energy that has been around for billions and billions of years, that's evolved to the highest point of evolution, it can survive in any hostile environment. What would it do forever? It would do us. It would do everything that we see around us just to experience it. I don't know. Alan Watts has made some really compelling arguments to me. You probably heard him talk about, like, if you could dream every night and in your dreams, you could have anything that you wanted, what would those dreams start off being like? They'd be really, really decadent, right? But eventually you'd get bored of that. And then what would you want to dream? Well, you'd eventually want to get to a place where you would forget that you were even the one that was dreaming it, and you were having these experiences that are very like real, and they get your blood pumping and they're exciting and it's all of this stuff. And then you wake up from it and you realize, oh, this was all just a dream kind of thing. Those kinds of stories really spoke to me and made a lot of sense to me. If there is some kind of life that's evolving in the universe, what would it be? So I like those ideas, and so I wanted to play with those ideas, and so I play with them in the book Bathing with God.
You have a part in the book where you're questioning this other voice, Quad.
Yeah.
And you're questioning him about, we humans are intelligent.
Yeah.
And his response in trying to show you that the intelligence goes all the way back tells the analogy of the apple tree. Would you mind sharing that with the listeners here?
Well, I think what I said was, what's the evidence? If you've got two trees and you want to know, is this an apple tree or an orange tree? You look at the fruit of it, and if it's an apple tree, then it's going to bear apples. If you're asking, is the intelligence that makes up, the subatomic intelligence that's in every cell, it's in every atom, in every electron of our body, is that intelligent? Because that's a big question, and science can't tell us if it's really intelligent, or even what that word intelligence means, because a lot of times we think of intelligence in human terms, like the ability to think and reason and make choices and things. And we go, well, that's not really intelligence. What we're talking about is more like DNA as a form of intelligence that is the blueprint for a single cell in the body to become any cell in the body. That intelligence is in the nucleus of every cell in the body. And then based on where in the body that cell is and the environment around it, it says, okay, I'm going to turn on these things, I'm going to shut off these things, and I'm going to become this kind of cell that does it. But there's that intelligence that's in there. And where does that intelligence come from in the DNA? So the fact that this energy creates intelligent, conscious beings that we recognize in ourselves would suggest to me that intelligence is itself intelligent and conscious, aware, even if it's a different form of awareness than what we're familiar with as humans. And so that was kind of an apple tree, apples, an intelligence creates intelligent beings. I think that was the reasoning that I talked about.
Yeah, planet Earth peoples, right? And so
peoples.
And it does lots of other things, and dogs and trees, and you know. But if we're intelligent, we have this idea in science that matter's neither created nor destroyed.
Yeah.
And there is some understanding. All of us can kind of just grab at the fringes of it. This idea that if we're intelligence, where did intelligence begin? And could intelligence have been born out of non-intelligence? And that seems to just feel counter to this innate kind of understanding that we're born with.
And even asking the question, where did it begin? Where did it begin is relying on this idea that there is a beginning and that there is an end. But when you listen to theoretical physicists, they tell you, no, there really isn't. I mean, have you listened? Brian Greene was recently on Joe Rogan. I think in February of 2020, they did an interview, and it was great. Have you heard that?
I don't know necessarily all of his guests by name, but that sounds familiar, and I do listen to a lot of Joe Rogan.
Okay. Brian Greene was a huge influence on me. So Brian Greene did a Nova four-part series called The Fabric of the Cosmos. And it's an hour about time, an hour about space, an hour about quantum mechanics, an hour about the multiverse. And this was, I think, done in 2011. So it's not even the most, it's 9 years old at this point, but it's still, people don't seem to understand that this is the world that we live in. It's like we're still kind of backwards based on what we're taught in school about electrons and neutrons being like billiard balls that go around these things. We really haven't updated our view of what reality is to where our current science is telling us. So, Joe Rogan did an interview with Brian Greene, and they talked about, Joe Rogan says, I've always wanted to ask a guy like you, what was before the Big Bang? And Brian Greene says, well, there's two ways that I like to think of that. One is that this Big Bang could be just one in an infinite number of Big Bangs. Or it could be that the question doesn't really even make any sense because we're asking about something like what happened before. And it may have been that the Big Bang is what kicked off, what started time itself, that there was no time and that there really is no time outside of the fabric of space-time that was created as a result of the Big Bang. And if you go into Einstein's theories of relativity about like what time is and the relationship between time and space, it's nuts. It's crazy. It's so counterintuitive to the way that we actually experience life and experience the world. But this is what our best science is telling us, that all time exists all the time. Future, past, and present events already exist within the fabric of space-time. How is that even possible? What does that even mean? So again, going back to that question that I asked earlier, what does it mean to be woke or awake or almost awake, is going, okay, all right, there's stuff about the nature of reality that I can't even pretend to understand, that I can't even really pretend to put a name on. But there's these things that are going on. I don't really know what it is. I'm just going to say it's all a fiction and have to live with I just have to be comfortable with uncertainty and that I just don't really know. And that what we do know, what our smartest people are telling us, doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense to me.
Yeah, I think it was Brian Greene, because now that you're saying that, it rings a bell for some of the things that I've listened to from Rogan. But this idea that there really might be, again, some of the brightest minds say there really might be like parallel universes, and there might be Glens in other places who, you just made one little different choice here and there, and now you're staying in the home 3 houses down instead of the house you're in right now, and enjoying a life that's almost the same but also very different.
Yeah.
Some of that's crazy.
Yeah, and so it's totally bizarre. And so, but it's a sandbox that I really love playing in. It's fun to try to imagine how would that even make sense. And so I thought of it in terms of, like I remember an episode of Infants on Thrones that we did several years ago, and we were talking about like living for eternity, living for all time and eternity. And Brother Jake said something like, wouldn't you get bored? Like, how long could you live before you just get so bored that you didn't want to live anymore? Like, what would you do? And I think it just makes sense that what you would do is create TV shows like we create TV shows, except you would make them not just 3D where you can put on these 3D glasses and wow, it's almost like it's real. But what if we could add all of our sensory data, so you could smell what's on the screen, you could feel what what the emotions of what the characters are feeling, you could actually get into the character and experience it from this point of view or that point of view. Like, how far away is our technology from really allowing us to do that? And if we continue to live for hundreds of thousands of years, don't you expect that our technology to entertain ourselves would go along that kind of trajectory? So if there was some kind of energy that had evolved to fill up the entirety of space and be this massive intelligent being, it makes sense to me that they would entertain themselves by becoming us and experiencing us. And so what are we? Are we like a museum? It's like an interactive museum that they can go in and have virtual reality. These are all these kind of like imaginary games that I played with that I started writing about it just as I was taking baths on my phone, and then turned them into chapters of this book.
Yeah. Some of the things you're saying resonate, which is earlier you mentioned, all of our cells are their own like living organism. Yeah. And I remember reading some science, I don't know, 6 months ago or so, that talked about the various organs in our body have their own kind of conscious awareness of what their responsibilities are and what functions they need to carry out. And even at the cellular level, that's true, which is what you're pointing to. And there's a part in the book where you talk about you're posing to this voice quad. You're posing to this voice quad that you see the world as it really is. You see reality. And then Quad comes back with this analogy about the shrimp, the snake, the bat, the mushroom, the tree, and how I think there's a tree that everybody's looking at, right? Yeah. And you're being asked about, how do you see it? And it's these 3 photon receptors you've got in your eyes. And so your color range is very limited. The shrimp, I think you said, has 19 receptors. Like and so the colors it sees would be so much more vibrant. And we humans couldn't even fathom the color spectrum that the shrimp sees. The bat is using sonar essentially. And so it's doing that. And you talk about how mushrooms have their own consciousness, which is super fascinating for listeners. And of course, obviously you know this, but if there's a fire that starts on one side of the forest, the mushrooms through the mycelium underground send messages not only to all the other mushroom species, but they also send a message to all the other plant life, all the trees and other plants. And telling them to turn their leaves a certain way, telling them to send certain chemicals down and certain chemicals up that will protect them the best possible against this heat and fire that's coming. And to me, that is incredibly fascinating. Again, it's not consciousness as we humans have defined it because we're the ones setting the bar, but on some level, there is consciousness of some other kind available in all of these other species, including the plants themselves.
Yeah, and the communication that is happening in ways that we can't really even fathom because that's not how we communicate. But it's happening, and it's and why wouldn't it? Because we are extensions of nature. They are extensions of nature. We're this intelligent energy. They're this intelligent energy. They've gone down different evolutionary paths than we have. But this is like the energy that peoples, that apples, that mushrooms, that does all of these things. You said something earlier about this idea of the universe as being one like gigantic neural network, like it's all the mind of God, if you want to call it that way. There's communication that's happening at all different kinds of levels that we're just not really aware of because we're so hypnotized by what comes in through our physical senses and the things that we think are important and the things that aren't important. I mean, I don't want to belittle it because I think that's the danger and that's the trap of these kinds of discussions, which I love having these kinds of discussions. But when I'm talking with friends of mine, they're like, okay, well, let's just call time out. How does this help me in my everyday life? How is this practical in any way? And that's where I think I lose a lot of people. But for me, the answer to that is it makes me far less judgmental. It makes me far less, it makes me far more interested when I recognize that I am this unique way that source energy is expressing itself in the human form, that nobody's had the kinds of experiences that I've had. Then I know that about you too. No one has had the kinds of experiences that you've had. And so that makes me really interested to know, how do you see the world? What does it look like to you? And instead of thinking, I've got all the answers, I know what's right, and if you don't agree with me, then that means that you're wrong. I'm like, oh, if you don't agree with me, that means that you've had different experiences. I want to find out about that. I want to understand why there's this difference, why you feel this way, and come at it from a place of love, in the sense that if you take the way that you see the world and you take the way that I see the world, and everybody else sees the world, even the mushrooms, even the trees, even the shrimp, like even the bats, like the way that we're all experiencing all together, that is kind of the way that I see God. Like God is the accumulation of all of the different ways of experiencing reality, because that's what this energy is doing. This energy is creating all these things. And I think it's also aware of what it's creating, and it's recording it in kind of like a data. Do you know Rupert Sheldrake?
I don't. I obviously, as we've had this conversation, you've been pointing out names that I don't have a clue about. So I'm gonna have to go out and become more awakened and read some more work.
Well, Rupert Sheldrake has a banned TED Talk, and again, we did an episode on Infants on Thrones about this banned TED Talk. That was really disappointing to me, because I wanted to talk about some of these ideas, and we ended up just kind of like bashing about like what's true and what's not true. But Rupert Sheldrake has this theory called morphic resonance, where he talks about the laws of nature aren't really laws as much as they're habits of nature. And so you were talking about the way that mushrooms communicate, like if there's a fire and they can warn other, plant life in there. I heard an interview, this is another Joe Rogan podcast with Paul Stamets, and he was talking about mushrooms and how if they come across a food source and they figure out how to synthesize that food source, immediately within that mycelial network, even if it's miles and miles away, that information, that intelligence on how to synthesize this food source is communicated throughout that network. And so other parts of it know how to do this. Yeah. So Rupert Sheldrake has this idea of morphic resonance, which is basically there's these habits of nature that once something in nature learns how to do something, like this mushroom learning how to synthesize this food source, then the next time that it happens with something similar, it's a quicker assimilation, because it's kind of like Carl Jung's collective unconscious, that there is this shared network of information that everything is tapped into. So like what Rupert Sheldrake talks about is that if there's rats that are put into a maze in London, and then they figure out how to make their way through the maze in London, if they put them in a similar maze in Beijing, and the rats have never had any kind of interaction with each other, just the fact that the rats in London have learned how to get through it faster than the rats in Beijing will get through it faster, because they're connected to some kind of network in their species where that intelligence is communicated at some kind of energetic level. And that is viewed as woo among a very materialistic scientific group. So Rupert Sheldrake came out, and in this TEDx talk, he said, here are the 10 different dogmas of the materialistic worldview. He upset a lot of people that said, no, we scientists don't have a materialistic worldview. We're separate and we're outside of that. So it's a really interesting thing to look at and to pay attention to. But Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphic resonance was another one of these influences on me that seemed to make sense. I was watching a documentary once that was, I think, BBC Earth or something. It was talking about a mother polar bear and her 2 cubs, that these cubs are like 3 weeks old, and they come out of the cave and they're foraging for food, and they have to get across a certain passage before the ice melts, and they're stuck on this land, and they don't get it. And somehow they know where to go. They know how to do it. They have these instincts that just kind of they're born with. And I was watching this and thinking, how do they know this stuff? Like, where does this come from? And so when I heard Rupert Sheldrake talk about morphic resonance, this idea, which is again similar to Carl Jung's collective unconscious, that we all are part of this energy, that there's this data that's stored somewhere and people can tap into it and kind of learn from it and have these habits of nature or instincts that kind of come from somewhere, but we don't really know where it's coming from. Thinking about these things just really turned me on, man. I'll put it like that. I just thought it was a really cool idea.
Yeah, there's, I know recently too, I mean, again, I'm pointing to a lot of these science articles that I've read recently, but about a year ago came across something that said that different experiences we have are somehow stored within us on the level of DNA, so that when traumatic experiences happen, they've done, again, studies and research where they've essentially taken people, followed them through their life, saw that certain traumatic experiences had happened to them. And if they had children after that traumatic experience, that child is equipped differently to handle a similar experience than a child that was born before the traumatic experience happened to the parent. And so the research has come out showing that on some level, there is a stored memory of the things that we go through in our life. And it's not a memory like you and I would recall a memory and go like, oh, I remember my birthday party and the cake frosting was red. And I remember the number of candles and I remember what my first toy was. But rather, there is something stored in our DNA with the experiences that we have that prepare the next generation to be able to handle those experiences differently, sometimes better and sometimes worse. But again, there's an echo of what went before us. I know, for instance, children, when babies are born, there's an innate awareness inside that child that knows that if it smiles or makes a face, it's more likely to get good care and the attention of its parents. And so there are some babies that fail to be able to do certain basic facial expressions at birth that other babies can. And it's one of these adaptive behaviors that the child almost knows that it needs to do this thing in order to get the attention from its parents so that it survives and makes it along. And yet, like you say, here's a baby, how does it know anything? And the reality is, even human babies, because we see it in the animal species, right? We see the deer pop out and within, an hour, the deer's up walking and moving around and following mom and trying to live in the world. Whereas us humans, because of our intelligence, we take longer to develop. But even at the newborn baby stage, there are certain behaviors that we are born with that lead to our survival.
Yeah.
Truth. You talk about truth in the podcast, and I think you're capturing it here when you talk about reality. And the only way to really capture reality is to capture all perspectives of the external world by every single person and animal and plant life and any other life forms on the earth that are experiencing the outside world. Like, you have to capture all of them to fully capture reality. And in the podcast, you seem to deeply recognize that any one perspective, whether it's even an entire species, fails to capture reality as it really is. And so all of us, again, all things are fictions. But you talk about truth, and Quad kind of gives you a lot of pushback in the conversation. That really, truth as you know it, you're trying to hold to this ground of like, it's true, it's accurate, it's complete. And Quad's trying to convince you that nothing is, like no view is. How do you perceive truth today? And so to chase down Alan Watts rather than go read the Quran, you're choosing to spend your time in certain spaces of information. So you're making a choice that information is either more important or more interesting or entertaining to you than other places of information. How do you wrestle with the word truth today? And what would you want others to kind of think about or wrestle with the word truth?
Well, I guess what I would hope others would do, and it's the same thing that I hope that myself would do, is put a huge asterisk next to the word truth anytime we use it. And what that asterisk would do is to say, we're talking about the way that things look from this perspective, that there are certain things that are true. But mostly, I guess the way that our physical senses evolved, I was watching another TED Talk by a guy named David Eagleman, who was talking about the way that our eyes have evolved to detect the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's less than 1/1000th of a percent or something. It's just this very small fraction of everything that's out there that we're actually able to detect with our eyes, with our ears, with any of our other physical senses. And so, and that like dark matter that fills the universe, that there's been estimates of like 95% of it but we don't know what it is. The scientists can't really see it. They can just kind of detect that there's something that's interacting with other things. They can see that there's a force so they just put this label on it of dark matter, but they don't really know, is it even a single thing? Is it a lot of different things? They don't know what it is. But 95% of the universe is what they don't know what it is. So how can you ever make any claim of truth when you recognize that there's such a large percentage of reality, if you want to use that word, that we just don't know what it is? So for me, truth, you want to put a big asterisk on it and say that here's what I know. What I know is what I'm experiencing and what I'm perceiving right now. And I recognize that what I'm perceiving is a small fraction of what's out there. And that small fraction is also being filtered through my own mind and my experiences and my biases and my beliefs. And that's going to determine what it is that I think is real and what I think is true. And it's true that I'm having that experience, and it's true that I think that this thing is true, but is it really true? Is it true outside of my own experience of it and my own thoughts of it and my own beliefs about what it is? I think there needs to be this asterisk there that's just taking a big humble pill. And, like I said before, I'm very interested in other people's truths. Like I want to know. I want to know what other people's truths are, and I don't want to argue anymore. I don't care about being right like I used to care about being right. I don't want to argue about being right. I just want to know, like, why is it that this is important to you? What's going on with you in your life? And you mentioned earlier these children that are born in the world, and this has been something that I don't remember where I heard it, but it was really impactful. That everyone that's born is born innocent, and from the first second that we come out of the womb, we're misguided by well-meaning people around us that think that they know the truth. They think that they know what's real in the world. They think they know the best way to love and be loved, but there's flaws in it. It's imperfect. And we grow up thinking that these things that we're told are true. And so we're misguided, and everybody's misguided in different ways. But at our core, we're all still that innocent baby that was born in here that's just been misguided. And so I'm not interested in arguing about the way that you were misguided versus the way that I'm misguided, and I was misguided in ways that weren't as bad as the way that you were misguided, or anything like that. Like I don't care about playing that game anymore. So truth, what is truth? I don't even know what truth is. I listened to these debates that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had a couple of years ago about truth, and they spent a podcast that was like 2.5 hours. They couldn't even agree on a definition of truth. And I think they did 4 other episodes after that. And I listened to a couple of them. And what I really liked that came out of it in their subsequent discussions, Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson said, "Look, Sam, you keep talking about truth as if truth is something that you're able to objectively determine. But there is always some filter between you and truth in your perception, your physical senses, and the way that your mind makes sense of it. You can never actually get to truth. You can never actually get to reality. You can only ever get to your perception of it. And your perception of it isn't going to be identical to other people's perceptions of it. And a lot of times those perceptions come in the form of myths or other kinds of fictions, other kinds of stories. So we just got to be really careful when we're talking about truth as if it's like this one unalterable thing. I mean, even our best scientists know that when you get new, better data, you update whatever the previous truth was. So truth is always in a constant state of flux and being updated by better data. So asterisk, man. Yeah. Putting an asterisk by truth. That's my answer there.
You talked earlier about what it is that you get from leaning into awakeness. And as you were having that conversation, as you're answering that question, it made me think of like, what does it do for me? And it slows me down enough to, as you pointed out, when my wife and I are having a conversation, and like all couples, we sometimes get into fights. And our fights are often based on how we both experienced the same external stimuli differently. And I used to come from a place, and I think most of us did on the first half of life, where whatever happened, we're like, look, I know I experienced it the right way, and that person misunderstood. And it really is messier than that, in that every one of us is experiencing the world very differently. And we make this assumption, like, you're a human, I'm a human, you've got 2 eyes, I've got 2 eyes. Red looks exactly the same to you as it looks to me. And words mean the same thing to you that they mean to me. And the reality is that in any given experience, whether it's watching a sports game with our father, whether it's being in an argument with our wife, whether it's going through some experience at work, every single human being involved in that experience does experience the thing differently. And so it slowed me down enough in the last few years that I really try in these conversations where emotion jumps in and people are picking sides and walls are going up, to try to slow the conversation down and try to ask myself and everyone else in the conversation to let their walls down, to just soften up a little bit, and let's just talk about what we experienced and how we saw it, and let's try to understand the other person's view.
Yeah.
It really, being awakened, I think, has made me more compassionate and has made me more understanding and has granted to others their messiness, because it's not mine, but I can now understand how it got there.
Yeah.
Anyway, just my 2 cents there on kind of some of the things that you're talking about.
I love it. I had this experience yesterday, Bill. So I'm twice divorced. High five. Okay. And but I'm in a relationship now, and I'm living with someone, and we're very much in love, and we're both on the same page with this kind of how do we accept the messiness in each other. And when we get into these kinds of arguments, it is such a different experience from anything that I've ever experienced before. And just yesterday we had this experience where she had some things that were going on that were really triggering her fight or flight response. And my immediate response was, okay, I'm not being triggered by this. I don't have this norepinephrine surging through my body the way that she does. That actually, I don't. Do you have scorpions in St. George? We've got a lot of scorpions down here in Chandler, Arizona. And I go out and I hunt scorpions at night with the black light and a blowtorch, and it's so fun because I burn these scorpions and I watch them. I was thinking about this the other night. As soon as it feels the heat of the flame on it, its whole consciousness changed, and it starts scurrying to try and get out. And the movement that it makes, it's like focusing all of its attention on how do I get away from this thing that is a threat to me, this fight or flight response in the scorpion. We have the same kinds of things in us. And when we get into arguments with our spouses or our friends or anything else, we have this fight or flight response that the norepinephrine kicks in, our whole mind kind of narrows, our energy goes towards a very narrow range of responses that is going to be a fight or flight thing. And so I recognized that she was in this place. I wasn't in that place. And I also knew that in times past, I would have been very judgmental and go, oh, you're making a mistake because you're not thinking rationally here. You're thinking with this really limited kind of fight or flight thing. But because we've been spending this time working on being awake and being more accepting and being more loving and being less judgmental, I really was able to get out of that place of judgment in myself and put myself into her shoes and say, okay, from her life experience, from her past interactions with these people that are now triggering this thing in her now, I can understand why her brain as a prediction engine would take all of her past experiences and see this new stimulus coming in and go predict, oh, doom and gloom, this is what's going to happen here. Even though I can go, yeah, that's not really what's going to happen. It's going to be okay. But in that state, she didn't want to hear that. She didn't want me to tell her that she was wrong. She didn't want anything like that. But I was able to be there with her, and in a very loving way that we were both able to talk about afterwards. And instead of her getting angry at me and then lashing out at me because I'm also threatening or she's feeling like she's in danger. It was just this great, it was this great experience, and our whole relationship is like that. We keep doing things, and then when I'm in situations where I'm getting triggered in my fight or flight response she's able to be there for me and help walk me through it and be kind of like a voice of reason. But it's more just kind of like, I'm going to let you experience what it is that you're experiencing and trust that you're going to come out of it. You're going to recognize that things are okay, and I'm here with you the entire time. And so that's one way that this different way of viewing the world has had a very profound change in my life, and in the way that I experience reality, in the way that I experience my own internal reality. And I'll give you 2 more names and 2 more books that may or may not be on your radar. Michael Singer, The Untethered Soul, and also The Surrender Experiment. And if you go on Sounds True, you can get an 8-part series that Michael Singer did on the Surrender Experiment, where he talks about why it is that we go into these fight or flight things. And he introduces this idea of samskaras. Samskaras is like a Sanskrit word that is talking about all of your past experiences that then become the filter through which you filter reality. And boy, that really changed the way that I saw myself and other people around me. And then right after reading that, I read David Hawkins' Letting Go. And that was just life-changing. And the idea of letting go, like I have this conversation with friends of mine when I say, oh, you just need to let that go. And they go, that sounds really dismissive that you're saying let it go. I have this conversation with Quad in the book as well. It comes up several times. And the idea of letting go is that you figure out the things that are the fictions, the things that are not true, but you're telling yourself as if they're true, and you let go of the false things. You just let go of what you don't know. And don't create all these things that make you worry about stuff or make you fear about things like that. The letting go. I think Michael Singer asks in The Untethered Soul, I think it's chapter 15, do you want to be happy no matter what? It's really simple. It comes down to this question. Do you want to be happy no matter what? You go, yeah. Okay. Well, then why aren't you happy? Well, because my wife said this or my boss did this or anything. Okay. So you don't really want to be happy no matter what. You only want to be happy under certain conditions. You only want to be happy if life shows up in the way that you prefer it to. Don't you recognize that it's your own preferences that are keeping you miserable? Because you can't expect life to just show up exactly the way that you want it to. Is life the thing that needs to change, or is it your own expectations? And why do you have those expectations? And this is where he goes into that discussion about samskaras and stuff. So I don't know. Am I overwhelming you with what I'm saying here?
No, I find all this interesting. I think being in the space of awakenness, one of the things that I've gotten really good at is being present. And when you're present, you're not really worried about the past, and you're not really trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future. You just try to take care of what you're supposed to take care of in this moment. Yeah. And as we pointed to Alan Watts earlier, Alan Watts references that the creative moment is now. The creative moment is in this moment. Every time you ever created anything, anytime you ever did anything, you did it in this moment. It's the present moment you did it in. Right. And I think you're your best self when you're present. When I'm present and aware that I'm aware, I get to bring all my faculties and all my gifts into this moment. Yeah. I'm not trying to multitask the past to the future with now. And somebody else, I can't remember who it was, but somebody else said, we humans are always treating the present as if it's the past. And what that means for the listener, what that means is essentially like you're always worried about the next moment. So this one is just getting disregarded. And the moment you start taking advantage of and leaning into and being present for this moment, you actually enjoy your life much more. Now, I still get thrown off sometimes. The IRS reached out to me a couple of weeks ago by letter. And for our 501c3 Mormon discussion, I did the taxes myself. Shouldn't have done it. We finally reached that threshold when you make more than 50 grand as an entity, you have to fill out the 990 easy form instead of the postcard. And the postcard's simple. You just say, yeah, I made 50,000 or less, and they leave you alone for another year. But when you do the 990 easy, it's like 25 pages. And I tried to do the whole thing. The IRS writes me, and the letters from the IRS are, because you didn't complete the Schedule O form, it's going to cost you $3,000 plus, up to 5% of what your entity made this year, plus $20 a day, whatever. And suddenly I find myself panicking, and I couldn't be present. And I slept like 2 hours as I'm trying in my brain to go like, oh, what do I do? How do I solve this? Right. When we're present, we are our best self, and we bring the most gifts to the table to be able to be the most productive in our life. But it's not easy. And even the best of us get sidetracked by lizard brain when stuff arises that feels scary or threatening. Yeah. And is scary and is threatening because, just by having a changed mindset doesn't take away the IRS. And, they're going to get what they're going to get. They're going to do it. And, so it's just getting out of that mindset of feeling like, oh, I'm not going to be able to survive this hit. Oh, you'll survive the hit and you'll learn from it. Yeah. And, like being able to look back on it with an attitude of gratitude and be like, oh, I'm glad that I learned this thing. Yeah, I'm not going to do that easy tax thing next time. And how great is it that you've got this 501c3 that is touching enough people's lives that you're making over $50,000? So it's like taking those kinds of things and going, oh, I'm going to train myself to tell different stories about what it is that's happening that's going to put me more in a place of gratitude than in this place of fear and anxiety. And it isn't that it's wrong to be afraid of what's happening and to stay up and have those sleepless hours and wondering what's going on. But it's not, it's not the end of the world, and it's not the only way to interpret what's happening. Yeah. I've got a friend who just finished a 1-year term in prison. I actually interviewed her on the Almost Awakened podcast an episode or two ago, and she went in for some financial, misdeeds. Right. And she even, it comes across in the interview. She was almost grateful for the chance to serve the time and get this thing off her back. Yeah. Like here she was, she had the anxiety of getting caught and being in trouble. And she goes to a female prison camp, stays there for a year. And she essentially says, like, look, it was almost positive inside me to be able to be accountable to the thing that I did and to serve the time and to be able to enter back into society. Essentially, yes, some of this isn't a clean slate because you're a felon, but you also get to go back into society saying, I served my time, I paid my price, my conscience gets to essentially start over and start afresh. Yeah. And so I think we humans are constantly worried about what the past means to us, worried about what the future holds. And, like you say, whatever comes up, whatever happens to any one of us, and we're all going to have to deal with stuff. Some of the listeners are going to have a child die before their time. Some of the listeners are going to have freak accidents and have their health impacted. People are going to be fired not expecting it, and others will be fired expecting it. Like life brings challenges and trials, and yet, as you're pointing out, those things are going to happen. We can, at least more and more as we lean into it, be happier in spite of what goes on around us.
Yeah. And I think gratitude's the way to go with that, because I really believe that in any situation you can legitimately, truthfully find something to be thankful for, without having to bury your head in the sand and make stuff up. You can find some kind of a silver lining. And that can put you in a better place to weather the storms when they come, because they do come, because that's life.
Yeah. Yeah. I got two more questions for you and I'll let you go. The first one is in your conversation with Quad brings up this idea of Dumbo's feather.
Oh yeah.
And I thought was such a useful analogy. Yeah. Because as you and I have spent time in a certain religion, and all of us spend time in systems, religious systems, political systems, systems that are based on country and law. I often, when I learned that a particular system was dishonest with me, and as I went back into other systems around me and began to realize that they also didn't tell the most accurate story, and again, recognizing that all stories are fictions. Yeah. But when I realized my history book told me very simplified, whitewashed narratives about the presidents of our country, and about other quote unquote American heroes, and recognizing we also withheld and distanced ourselves from the stories about how we traumatize the indigenous people and the damage we do to species all over the planet. The analogy of Dumbo's feather was kind of a pause for me, because I had to then re-examine that just because something wasn't true doesn't mean that all it did was harm me. Yeah. And so it got me thinking, and again, I've always tried to acknowledge this, but even the systems around me that I think are deeply untrue and cause trauma, I also have to grant that they gave me skills and gifts and experiences that also brought me to this moment. And I like who I am. I like me. And they're the true things they gave me and the untrue things they gave me. And again, I'm understanding between you and I that all things miss the mark of being absolutely true. But the good traits, the good skills, the good principles that were there, and the bad ones are also part of what made me me and made you you. And so there is some level of even being gracious to the bad stuff that happens to us, even when others intentionally impart that bad stuff. To some degree, if you like who you are, all of these things have been thrown into the pot and made you you.
Yeah. Do you ever listen to Jason Mraz?
A little bit.
Man, I freaking love him. My partner turned me on to Jason Mraz, and he released an album in June that's called "Look for the Good," and I've started using that theme song "Look for the Good" with Infants on Thrones now. Like for the longest time, I started using a line from a Broken Bells song that's called "After Your Faith Has Let You Down," and I still use that, but now I follow it up with "Look for the good in everyone, look for the good in everything." That's this Jason Mraz song. And at the end of that album, he's got a song called "Gratitude." And it starts off by saying, "I thank the boys who kicked my ass when I was 17. I thank the ones who stood around and those who acted mean. I thank the bullies for all the accidents. They changed my life. They made me love who I am today." and he goes through this thing of like, I thank the girls that turned me down and never gave me a second chance. I think, I'm grateful for my parents that they divorced. When they divided, they multiplied, and 2 parents became 4. And it's this kind of Pollyanna view of the world that a previous version of me would have been very cynical of, and just like made fun and dismissed offhand. But for whatever reason, over the last several years, I've become much more open to that and recognizing the power that gratitude has, and changing your mindset and changing my own mindset. And it really does make a difference. And I'm curious, Bill, I don't know if you're willing to do this. I'd like to know more about your Almost Awakened podcast and like what made you start doing this, like changing what you had been doing before, going this direction. Because I knew that you were doing it, but it wasn't until like I'd listened to the most 2 recent episodes that you did you did an Alan Watts one, and then you did one with Phil McLemore. I listened to those 2, but I don't think I'd listened to them before. But it's so interesting to me that you and I have been kind of parallel in this ex-Mormon podcasting space. We've interacted a few times, but not a ton. But we're kind of on similar trajectories, although I was never excommunicated and didn't have, kind of that same experience that you did. But I guess the biggest question that I have for you is, are you able to look back, and I think you touched on this a little bit, with experiences that you had with that unnamed organization, and look at all that with gratitude instead of hurt, pain, hatred? I don't know what kind of emotions you have with it, with that experience.
Yeah. So 2 things. One, you asked why am I doing this now instead of what I used to do? And what I used to do just isn't interesting anymore.
Yeah.
And so as I've so in our religious
and you were
system,
smart in rebranding it, I think, like, cause I didn't rebrand Infants on Thrones. I just started changing the way that I was doing, and the other guys that were doing it, like, I'm not interested in that. I'm out.
Right. One is that in our previous system, we were told what a wisdom teacher would look like. And the reality is that was a really low bar. The wisdom teachers in our faith tradition, if I can just be honest, aren't much of wisdom teachers at all. And so as I'm entering this awakened space and I'm listening to really great minds like Eckhart Tolle, Sam Harris, Alan Watts, I'm going to say his name backwards maybe, but Ram Dass. As I listen to the debates between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, as I read Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, as I read Reza Aslan's Jonathan Haidt and *Elevation of Motion* and some of the things he's written, as I read Reza Aslan's *Zealot* and *God*, what I realized was my bar for a wisdom teacher was pretty damn low. And I no longer needed to spend my time and energy deconstructing this little system over here, but instead I wanted to start talking about all the beauty that's all around us that so many of us are missing. And if you look at the logo for Almost Awakened, it's a person's head kind of exploding, and at the top are these psilocybin mushrooms, and then above that are all these funky colors, and it's leading to emblems of music and sexuality and shadow work and shackles of bondage that I think we all have when, as you point out, our parents taught us these limited, somewhat inaccurate, trauma-causing expectations of society and introduced shame to us. But awakeness involves everything. Like, there's no subject off limits now. There's no topic off limits. If I find an interesting thing about human development, I can share it. If I see an interesting thing that scientists are encountering in outer space, I can share it. If I have a friend or someone who has an interesting experience with psychedelics or conscious altering tools, I can share it. And nothing is off limits. So we've done interviews with people from the cannabis industry. We've done interviews with people who want to talk about relationships or sexuality. We've done interviews talking about music, and specifically reggae music, which I think is a gorgeous medium of music in this space of awakenness. No topics off limits. So that's kind of the answer to the first thing you asked. And then remind me your second question, which was the big one you said.
Yeah, I will in a second, but a follow-up on what happened to your audience when you switched from the podcast you were doing before to Almost Awakened? Did you retain most of that audience? Has it grown? Has it shrunk? Because mine has shrunk.
Yeah. So we were getting about 6 to 10,000 downloads an episode with the previous podcast centered around, Mormonism. And so I'll say it
you
there.
Said it, man.
I know. I said it. And what I anticipated would happen was now I was speaking about a topic and topics that applied to a much more general audience. Yeah. And I try to steer clear of talking about that religious system much. And I try to make the podcast interesting and the vernacular pertinent to a general audience. And I expected to essentially pick up where I left off and continue to grow. I experienced the same thing you did, which is that I get about 2,000 to 3,000 downloads an episode. Yeah. And I was expecting a general audience to start picking it up and listening to it. I never thought, I'm not, Joe Rogan's a phenomenon.
Sure.
But even outside of him, the You're Not So Smart podcast, Radio Lab, This American Life, those podcasts are phenomenal, and they have a professional production team from the beginning helping them research these topics and adding sound effects. Sure. And I just knew it could never be that. But what I hoped was, maybe I can get to 10,000 listens an episode, 15 to 20,000 listens an episode. Yeah. And that's still the hope. But the reality is, like you said, downloads have gone down. And I don't think the listeners from our previous work, when you're talking specifically about the conundrums within a religious system, I think most of those people, this stuff doesn't interest them. They haven't moved maybe to this space yet. They still want, it's still that Fowler stage 4 where they just want to be reaffirmed that their deconstruction was true.
Yeah. I think that's part. Yeah. And I don't think that there's as many people that would even be interested in moving into this space. Even my fellow infants that I podcasted with, there's a few of them that are interested in this kind of space, but most of them aren't. And they've just moved on to other things, and like religion or spirituality or these kinds of things just really aren't even that interesting to them. And I think the audience, but like I really don't even know who my audience is with Infants on Thrones anymore. And that's kind of sad, because I've been doing it for 8 years, and it's changed a lot over the years. And I used to really love doing these surveys and getting to know who the audience was and doing listener essays and having them submit stuff. And I feel kind of disconnected from that, from the audience, but I know there's still people that are there. I wonder if there's overlap between people who listen to me and people who listen to you, that we're in the same space, but I don't even know that. I have no idea. So yeah, that's curious to hear.
I like talking about these things. Yeah. I like, one of the things that's really good about a podcast, no matter how big or small, is you get to say your ideas and thoughts, and you get to point to the things that interest you, and you get to do it out loud to the rest of the world, and hope that somebody finds these things interesting. Right. I get feedback that the episodes are enjoyable, but a large chunk of the audience from prior has fallen off. Yeah. I don't know that I ever want to stop talking about these things. And so my goal is to just go a couple years doing this and see if it picks up and see what it does. Yeah. As I was listening to your audiobook, Bathing with God, I thought, man, that'd be a great name for a podcast. And you could use the book as this leapfrog into a podcast where you interview or monologue about these interesting things that come into your life in this space. I don't know if that's what is that kind of what you're doing with Infants on Thrones?
Well, Bathing with God is its own thing. So I've done some cross stuff, like I'm kind of force feeding Bathing with God on the Infants on Thrones audience, whether they want it or not, because it's me and this is what I'm creating. And the Bathing with God stuff was born on Infants on Thrones. And so I'm doing some stuff with that. I would very much like for Bathing with God to catch on and have the kind of numbers that Infants on Thrones had in its heyday, that you had in your heyday. But I don't know if this is that interesting to as many people or not, but I really like when I connect with people who are interested in it. And I especially like it when I interact with people who can recommend things to me, because every single name that I've mentioned, Jonathan Haidt, Michael Singer, David Hawkins, Alan Watts, all of these people I was introduced to because of people that I met through the podcast. And so much of my life is the way that it is now because of the way that I put myself out there with Infants on Thrones, people that I met through Infants on Thrones, and the way that those relationships developed. And so I'm hoping that Bathing with God will do something similar to that. But the other question that I asked you And since you already broke the taboo and you said Mormonism, how do you feel about Mormonism? How do you feel about your experience with it? And is that something that in your almost awakened state, you're able to look at with gratitude, with love, with compassion? Or is there still a lot of the kind of anger and hurt and bitterness around being lied to and deceived and, excommunicated and, like all that stuff that you went through?
Yeah. So let me work backwards. The excommunication didn't affect me negatively at all. I had recorded an episode that I knew would be the final straw.
Yeah.
And it had sat in my stored audio for about 1.5 years. I just didn't publish it because I knew when I published it, it would be the final thing. Yeah. So I published it, and 2 weeks later, the 2 guys show up and hand me a letter for a disciplinary trial, a religious disciplinary trial. And I expected it, was ready for it, knew it was coming. And that's the reason I released that episode when I did. And the excommunication was pleasant and enjoyable to go through. I enjoyed planning every step of it in order to push and nudge the people around me who were involved in that process to get them hopefully to just think and reflect a little bit about the process that they were imposing on me.
Yeah.
And so I enjoyed it.
What they really believe what they think that they're doing.
Right. And then I had a chance to go in, and of course it was recorded. I had a chance to go in and say my piece. A lot of people don't get to do that. A lot of people feel hushed and silenced in their religious setting, and they don't get to speak up. And here I had a chance to tell any Mormon who wants to ever know, gets to listen to what I said, and I got to go out stating my piece. Nobody can spread a rumor that I had done some sin or committed some atrocity in behavior, because in the audio, my stake president tells me that my integrity wasn't in question, that my issue was that I couldn't talk about the things I was talking about. And so I was able to leave peacefully. I still have anger with my previous religious system. I think most people in any high demand fundamentalist religion feel that as they wake up to it not being what they thought it was, and feeling the pressure from it to be silent or to receive trauma at its hand because you're not going along with the flow. So I still have anger and frustration, but I also wouldn't be me if, in other words, if I could go back and change it, would I? No, I would do all of it over again, because all of it brought me to this moment. And in this moment, my marriage is good. My kids are healthy. I have a great job. I love the company I work for. I enjoy going to work every day. I have the best friends on the planet. I get to wrestle with the big questions. I get to think critically about all kinds of ideas. I get to read and learn. I know what it's like to stand up for others who are marginalized. The life that I've lived has given me the ability to be and to experience the things that I have. So I wouldn't change a drop of it. And I'm grateful that as a 17-year-old kid who was kind of lost and he wouldn't have ended up here, that's for damn sure, if he hadn't encountered religion. Yeah. And so that system, it did 2 things. It gave him accolades and praise and opportunities that were hugely positive for me, that helped me develop skills like public speaking, that helped me develop skills such as reading lots of material and going into footnotes and studying sources and trying to understand what it means to actually learn information and to wrestle with your own preconceived notions of things. It also caused me trauma, and it harmed me, and it lied to me, and it deceived me. But that also gave me the ability to push back and stand up for myself, and to begin to see others who are hurt by these kinds of systems and to be a voice for them when it's necessary. I just wouldn't change anything. And so it's both. I'm still upset and angry, but it's such a tiny little piece of my, Glenn, if you were to come and spend a week with me in my house and go out with me and my friends, you would see that Mormonism is a shared story that allows all of us to connect to what is the same about us. Yeah. But then what really becomes interesting about my marriage and my relationship with my kids and my relationship with my job and with my friends is that what is way more interesting than what is the same about all of us is what's different. Mm-hmm. And so if you spend a week with us, you would see that Mormonism is not really part of my conversation anymore in my house. And with my friends, it's a way to get a laugh or a chuckle or to connect. But then we all go off and start talking about the big questions and the things we're reading and the stuff we're studying and the ideas ruminating in our heads. And none of it is this previous religious system. Life got way more fun and interesting when I was able to set that anger down and go through my week really not reflecting or spending any time in that space.
Yeah. Cool. Does being awakened to you include any kind of like forgiveness or like full unconditional love for the Mormon church, for Mormon people, for what it is, for all of those lies, all of that trauma, recognizing, like, because if you think that we are all expressions of this one energy, then these are just different versions of you. And so does being awakened, this is something that I've struggled with myself, and it's something that kind of comes up in the book, Bathing with God. I explore these kinds of questions. Is that kind of forgiveness, is that kind of love something that is desirable? Is it something that you're wanting? Is it something you feel like you've achieved? Is it something that you feel like even need? Where does that fit into being awakened?
Yeah. I certainly think forgiveness is part of the space of awakening, because as you say, you begin to see yourself as these folks are manifestations of you, just under a different set of circumstances.
Yeah.
Right. Like you are this other person who just lived their life differently and encountered different things. So I agree that forgiveness is part of it. I don't know that I'm there yet.
But when you say, does that mean that you think that someday you will, or that you even want to, or that you think that you should be?
I certainly have moved from deep anger and resentment to maybe a state of apathy. And so since I've moved from that to apathy, I hold out space that at some future point, maybe I move from apathy to something else. And as I listen to, say, Thomas McConkie or Richard Rohr or Phil McLemore, in those wisdom voices within kind of our tradition or Christianity at large with Rohr, there's this idea of being grateful for all of it and granting compassion and gratitude to even the negative that happens to you. I don't know that I'm there yet. I'm kind of an 8 on the Enneagram. I'm a justice warrior. So when people step on my toes or step on the toes of people around me, I get pissed. And so it's just not a space that comes easy to me. Now on the other side of that, when I see other humans around me who are hurting me, and I have to be honest, unnecessarily, but unintentionally, I do have a space of like compassion, like, oh, like I can see why that person did that and why they felt it was necessary to take that step that actually hurt me or hurt my family. But I'm still struggling with systems when they do it, specifically that system that we came out of. It's not easy. And it's not all the time. It's, once a month something happens and it just triggers me and now I'm angry again for a little while. But it's not a moment. It's not a consistent thing. It's not a thing that bothers me daily. In fact, until you and I had this conversation, I don't know that I thought about Mormonism one time today. And I think most days are that way. I rarely think of it unless it's doing something to hurt me. But forgiveness, I think, is part of that. And I'm not there yet.
Yeah. I didn't know you were an 8. That's interesting.
Yeah. An 8 on the Enneagram.
What would you guess that I am? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, let me think this through. Let me think about each of these. So, you're not. I don't think you're a 9 peacemaker, right? No. And you're not. I think a 2 is a perfectionist.
No, the 1 is a perfectionist. The 2 is the helper.
Okay. Yeah. I know 7s are all over the place, trying different foods and experiencing the world in all its glory, trying to bounce around and enjoy everything that life has to offer. 4 is the creator and the artist. I'm going to go with number 4.
That's what I thought I was when I first heard the Enneagram. I am a 7.
You are? Okay.
I am a 7.
Yeah.
But I'm a healthy 7.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. So when you go to a restaurant, do you like to try everything? You want to order all kinds of appetizers? And whatever people are doing, if they're skydiving tomorrow, you want to go?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, like I when I was younger, I was more extroverted, and I'm more introverted now than I was then. And so that's kind of an interesting characteristic, because I don't think that most 7s are introverts, but I'm kind of more of an introverted 7 that's comfortable. 7s have the line to going to the 1, the perfectionist, when they're under stress, and going to a 5 when they're calm. And that 5 is a really comfortable place for introverts who like to research and really unpack things. But that's interesting that we've another parallel that we have, Bill, our interest in the Enneagram and kind of recognizing the value of locating yourself within that spectrum of personality types, while at the same time not stereotyping or like limiting where you are in it. But yeah, so for you to tell me that you're an 8 that's really out for justice, and you're on your white horse and you're tilting on all the windmills, that makes a lot of sense.
And the negatives of that, right? Like, I think I can fix the world, and I'm going to beat the world into the condition I want it to be in. And it's going to be fair as I define fair. And then realizing one day that you really have no power. You can be a voice, you can be one voice among many, and over a grand period of time, change certainly happens. But the reality is you're probably not going to change anything today. And the things you really want to change, sure as hell aren't going to change just because you spoke up and pushed for it. I want to ask you one last question, and that's about death. And let me frame it this way.
Okay.
When we talk about what lies beyond, and we do it in the way that you and Quad are having this conversation about reality and consciousness and what's real and what isn't. And I struggle with death. I'm scared to death of the last 3 minutes of dying. I think for most of us, that's not going to be a pleasant experience. And I often wonder if living present my whole life and enjoying a life well lived really matters in those last 3 minutes if you're having a heart attack. In other words, in the middle of whatever crisis your death is, do you in the midst of that go, man, at least I was grateful that I got to have all that fun while I was alive? I don't think we do. I think you're only going to be concerned about the process of dying as you're dying, and only worried about the sensations that it gives your body, and the worry and concern with all the things that come as you contemplate dying in those last few minutes. So one is the process of dying. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on. And then the second is death itself. In that I'm not really deeply bothered by death. I think it's a dirt nap. I think I die, and I think my consciousness is gone. And then I hear people, you in Bathing with God, or I hear Alan Watts, or I hear the idea that if my consciousness, if my memory of my life well lived doesn't continue on, if my consciousness and awareness of what my life looked like doesn't go on, and I don't think at death it does. I agree with you that matter is not created nor destroyed. The energy within me continues, and the matter that makes me up will go into making up the matter of other things, and I will become both the nourishment and the actual, to some degree, material of something after. But does any of that matter if my memory doesn't go on? Does any of that matter if my consciousness doesn't exist beyond death? If I don't get to go somewhere and go like, ooh, look at who I was, and now I'm here, and now there's this new thing, death becomes just an end, even if something on you continues but without your consciousness. What are your thoughts on death? Dying first, but then death. And do you actually think some awareness of who you were continues on? And if not, what does that do for your thoughts on death?
Okay. Well, boy, this is a really huge question to ask and wrapping up. There's so much that I could say about this. I think I want to share with you an experience that I've never talked about. I have participated in ayahuasca ceremonies, and I did that probably the first time was, I don't know, was it 2.5 years ago? Probably. And I had this experience with ayahuasca where I was really like, I drank this stuff, and for people who don't know, ayahuasca it's DMT is the chemical that interacts with your brain, and it's ingested through your stomach, through your liver, and there's an MOA inhibitor, so it's kind of a slow uptake, and it's maybe like a 4-hour experience, something like that. And you start feeling the effects of it maybe within 20 or 30 minutes of drinking it. And I was doing it in a setting where there was a shaman and there were other groups of people, and we're around in a circle, and everybody's kind of within their own experience. And I started feeling the effects coming on, and it was coming on in a way that I didn't like, because I like staying lucid. I like being aware. I don't want to be overtaken by some kind of psychedelic substance where I'm not in control. And I started feeling this thing come on really, really strong. And this was maybe the fourth time I had taken it. And I just was struggling with it. And I was thinking, why did I do this? I don't ever want to do this again. I stood up and I walked away from the circle, and I went into a bathroom in the place that we were in. And I'm like, oh no, I don't want to be alone right now. I went back out where there were people, and I was just like kind of sitting there, and I was like turning this way and that, and just like struggling. I just real struggle. I'm never going to do this again. I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. And I remembered what people kept telling me, to just like breathe, relax, go into it. You're going to be fine. I had fine experiences before. This was the fourth time I had tried it. So finally, after maybe 15 minutes of this really intense struggle, it was like Joseph Smith in the garden or in the grove with like Satan coming over. That's what I felt like. Finally, I relaxed into it, and all of that terror went away. And I started having a conversation with myself that's very similar. Like I've kind of recreated that experience in bathing with God. So if you want to call it an inner self or just like this imaginary guide or whatever it was, this voice came to me and said, that was interesting. What was that all about? What was all that struggle about? And I'm like, I've heard about ego death, and I don't want ego death. I don't want to die. I don't want to be erased from reality. I don't want to disappear. I don't want ego death. And the response came back with like, oh, that's cute. That's funny. So you think that you can control that, do you? You think that you're in charge of that, and you think that it's a death? Well, what if it's not a death? What if what we're doing right here is a marriage? What if what we're doing is the egoic part of you is loosening up, and it's surrendering, and it's becoming more in line with the part of you that is divine, and the part of you that knows much more about what's going on in this world than this egoic radar system of your physical senses that you most identify with? What if this is a marriage? And, the things that we can do together in harmony with each other are much greater than anything if you're struggling against it, or if you're, afraid of your own mortality and your death. That was a really, really profound experience for me, Bill. Really profound, really life-changing. And where I immediately went to with that is because I felt like I was having this conversation with my inner self, whatever that inner self is. And then I'm like, oh, I want to have a conversation with my ex-wife's inner self. So then we had this conversation, and I was, and it's all happening within my own imagination. I'm perfectly comfortable seeing it that way, but it felt so cathartic and healing to have these conversations with her, and this forgiveness that happened with her, and the conflicts that we had. And I'm like, oh yeah, I could see why I was really stubborn in these areas, and you were really stubborn in these areas, and it just didn't work out. And but we've got these kids, and all that, So I had that experience, and the experiences that I've had with ayahuasca since then, I haven't ever experienced that same kind of terror. So I don't know what those 3 minutes that you said. I don't know what the minutes preceding death are going to be like, but I'm not as afraid of that as I used to be because of this experience. I'm if it does turn out that I just take a dirt nap and there is no consciousness after that, I made peace with that a long time ago. Then what is there to worry about? There's no pain, there's no suffering. It's just peaceful oblivion, which it was before I was born, which it will be after I'm dead. I've got no fear of that. That's great. The only thing I really want to be concerned of is do I have a will in place that my kids will be taken care of, or something like that. But, as far as me passing, I don't have any fear of that. I don't want it to be something where I'm tortured and I'm suffering a lot of pain. But I also have heard accounts of people who have reported near-death experiences, and something happens with their consciousness where they're aware that they're in a car accident and there's all these horrible things that are going on around them, but they're not really feeling the pain. They're kind of like outside of it, experiencing it from outside. So maybe there's something, I don't know. I don't know. So I don't have that fear of death that I used to. And I think that experience with ayahuasca played a role in that. But as I've used my imagination to think more and more about what this intelligent energy that makes us up and has been around for at least 13.8 billion years since the time of the Big Bang, and has been evolving and gaining intelligence that it shares across the network. Like, you think mushrooms are the only things that do that? Mushrooms are made out of this energy. Why wouldn't this energy also do that? From every corner of the universe, everything that it ever is and everything that it ever experiences, it records in some kind of a database that's just this organically evolved intelligence, like DNA, but it's the DNA behind our DNA. And they're like, why couldn't that be? I think it's possible. So I can't come out and say I believe that, or I think that is how it is. But if you were twisting my arm and making me choose, I'd probably say, yeah, I think it's more likely that it's that than that it's not. I think it's more likely that because Einstein talked about all time exists all the time, that every version of who I am now, who I was as a kid, who I'm going to be 5 years from now, has always existed in the fabric of space-time. It always has existed in the fabric of space-time. So what does that mean when I die? When I die, we're still thinking of it in terms of linear time, but linear time isn't really what existence is. If you listen to Einstein. So what does that mean? Yeah, there's definitely this fear of the unknown, because it's unknown, but it's a cycle, and it's a process that there's death and there's rebirth, and this energy that we are isn't ever destroyed. And even, like when you watch these nature documentaries and you see cheetahs that are chasing the gazelles, and you're like, oh, I'm on the side of the gazelle because I don't want it to be harmed by the big bad cheetah. It's all life, like we do the same. Like, we can't live without destroying other forms of life around us. We can't avoid that. We consume other animals. We consume other plants. We are consumed by microbes when we die, and we become the source of life for other things. It's just this cycle. So I don't think that it's anything to be really afraid of. And this sense of an identity of Glenn Ostlund, who I am now, if Einstein's right that has always existed in the fabric of space-time, then maybe there is some kind of like organically evolved computer program code that's made out of up quarks and down quarks that act as like ones and zeros in this binary code of existence. And the program that is me and who I am in this place and time has always existed in the database of the universe. And that's just something that a very, very quantum level of where everything's just potential anyway that expresses these things. I don't know. There's just so many possibilities of what it could be that spending a lot of time worrying and being afraid of what it's going to be, I'm not in that place anymore, and really haven't been for a long time. So
yeah, I appreciate
that's how I feel about death, Bill.
I appreciate that. I just want to say, kind of as we're wrapping up, again, listeners, you can check out Bathing with God on iTunes. I loved the podcast. I loved Quad's voice, which is your voice, but altered. And I loved the back and forth that these two voices are having. I want to ask a favor of you. I wonder if at the end of this episode, if I could play episode 1, part of the audio, just to tease people. And hopefully that is, they find it as cool as I did, and they immediately go and check out the rest of it.
Sure. Yeah. And episode 1 is the preface and the introduction to the book. And then episode 2 is chapter 1.
Right. Right. So we can just give people a tease.
Yeah. Sure.
So if you shoot me that audio, I'll add it in. And listeners, I would just suggest, if you're in this space, which obviously you are, you're listening to the conversation Glenn and I are having right now. But if you're trying to figure out more about who you are and the way the world works and how we humans became what we did, and how we can be better at responding to others tomorrow, my suggestion is to check out Bathing with God with Glenn Ostlund. I want to say thank you. Like, this space is so much fun, and it did surprise me that you were in this space, and I'm just like it surprised you that I'm in this space. And I think when you're curious and you enjoy learning and you want to know what makes yourself tick and what makes others tick, it feels very natural to slowly move into these kinds of ideas and talking about these things, being present, ego, shadow work, human development, evolution, all that stuff. It's been fun to, if I can set my ego and my pride aside, your Bathing with God was fantastic. You were articulating things that I think about, but I couldn't word the way you did. And it was powerful to me to listen to what you produced so far with this project. And I really hope, like, bottom of my heart, I shared it with my entire friend group, and I shared it a couple times with a couple of really close friends, like, hey, don't play around here. You got to listen to this. You got to start right now.
Thank you.
I think it is the conversation that everybody in the almost awakened space is wrestling with and thinking about. And I just want to say thank you for putting it into audio form and producing it. And I know you've got it in written form too, but for me, it was important to hear those voices of Quad and you having the conversation.
And to make it available to anybody who wants to listen. They don't have to buy the book. They can just listen to the podcast for free. And if they like it and they want to buy the book, cool. I would love that. But if there's anything that I would ask a listener to do, is to send me an email and let me know that you're there. let me know that you're there, that you're listening to this. What does it mean to you? Like, who are you? Well, I love making those kinds of connections. Those kinds of connections have been so important to me over the 8 years that I've done Infants on Thrones, that, you know, especially in this space, because I do think that there are more people in the world that are interested in these kinds of conversations now than there were probably 10 years ago. But maybe that's just because I'm more interested in it now, and I'm more aware that it's going on, because Alan Watts, he was the late 60s. And I mean, even 40s and 50s and 60s, what Alan Watts was doing. Ram Dass was in that time frame, you know, like we're riding this tidal wave that's been going on for a long time. So if there's people that are out there that are surfing on the same wave, reaching out, saying hi, that's probably the thing that I like more than anything else, in doing this and sharing these ideas.
Love it. Well, we'll wrap up here, and I'll play for the listeners episode 1, which is kind of this preface, this introduction to the book, and kind of tease people into checking it out, because I think it really is amazing, and I really appreciate you doing it. And I do hope that whether the listening audience grows or not, that you, me, and all the other folks that are talking out loud into microphones about this stuff continue to do this work, because I think helping people learn to be present, helping people learn that their ego really isn't this permanent, important piece of them.
Yeah.
Learning what shadow work is, and learning how they react and respond to others, and beginning to examine and deconstruct my own and their own responses and reactions, so that we're healthier people tomorrow. You know, we could have gotten, and we won't, but we could have gotten into free will and talk about there really isn't. And I don't think there is free will. I can only do in this moment what my experience and my DNA has brought me to this moment to do. But if I'm aware that I'm aware, I can learn new tools so that tomorrow I can act differently. I'll still be able only to do what I could have done by what that experience brought me to in that moment, but I'll now have more tools and resources that allow my behaviors to be different.
Well, anytime you want to have a conversation like this, Bill, just let me know, because I'd love to get on and have a conversation with Free Will about you, or any of these other.
Yeah, I'd love sometime you and I got to sit down and just talk for 2 hours about ayahuasca. I've got a lot of things I want to say, and I don't know that I'm going to say them here. But I will tell you, Grandma Aya, for people I know that have done that, and you know, I'll leave some things unsaid, but that is the most spiritual experience I ever, you know, have seen others have, or you know, I'll tease it out. Maybe I've had my whole life. Insane the things. What I find, again, I don't want to go any further, but what I find so fascinating in the human mind is when we have experiences that a new truth comes out of your own head, and nobody around you handed that truth to you. And you pull this new truth out, and you're like, oh, I didn't know this before this moment about myself or about the world around me, but I know it now. And to learn something without going through the process of learning something, to me, is magical. And I've had those experiences on this side of life. And for those who've done ayahuasca, I think that happens. People can learn new things about themselves and their environment that they didn't have inside their head prior to that moment.
And whether it's some kind of a psychedelic, or if it's meditation, or just some other kind of traumatic like experience in your life, I think the experience of going through a faith crisis and leaving a religion like Mormonism is a really important way of breaking out of a cocoon, and then realizing, oh wait, I'm inside of another cocoon. Just like I was told that there's certain truths that I just accept as this is the way that the world is inside of Mormonism. Now I go, okay, no, it wasn't that way. I'm putting that behind me. Now there's other things like that out in the world. I look at my experience of leaving the Mormon church as kind of like training wheels for how to interact with the rest of the world, and this ancient idea of Maya and an illusion, and you know, that what is going on, what is really happening in this world. And that I see tremendous value in taking what I learned from exiting Mormonism and going, okay, I want to apply those same tools in just the everyday world, and asking the question, what is real? What is true? How do I really know? And anyway, so
I love
cool,
it.
Man.
Okay. Well, I love it. Thank you for your time tonight, Glenn. And for the listeners, here comes episode 1 of Glenn Ostlund's Bathing with God.
Welcome to Bathing with God, the free audiobook podcast from my imagination to yours. I'm Glenn Ostlund, And if you like what you hear and would like to purchase a print or Kindle version of the complete book, search for it on Amazon.com or go to the website bathingwithgod.com. And now I give you Bathing with God. Bathing with God. Rejecting?
Nope.
Struggling against?
Still no.
Playfully engaging?
That's it.
The divinity all around us. By Glenn Ostlund. Preface. When I was young, it seemed that life was so wonderful. A miracle. It was beautiful, magical, but then they sent me away to teach me how to be sensible, logical, intellectual, cynical. There are times when all the world's asleep. The questions run too deep for such a simple man. Won't you please tell me what we've learned? I know it sounds absurd. Please tell me who I am. The Logical Song, Supertramp. The second most difficult thing I ever did in my life was intentionally snuffing out my belief in God. He didn't even struggle as I held his head beneath that pillow. The single most difficult thing I did was when I unexpectedly breathed life back into him again. It took nearly forever just to find his lips. Welcome to the preface for Bathing with God. I am the author, Glenn Ostlund, and I am a walking, talking paradox. I imagine that you are too. I am both responsible and irresponsible, kind and cruel, intelligent and ignorant, lazy and highly productive, humble and arrogant, considerate of others and incredibly self-centered. I've been both a missionary for my church and an outspoken, mocking, ridiculing, podcasting atheist. I've been a husband and an ex-husband, a father, a son, a teacher, a student, a businessman, unemployed, a man of integrity, and a cheater. I've been both a privileged cultural insider and a foreign minority outsider, a leader and a follower, full of hope and joy, full of darkness and despair, a passionate believer, and an even more passionate skeptic. The idea of reincarnation both fascinates and confuses me, but I don't have to die and be reborn to know what it's like to live multiple lives. I've lived multiple lives in this lifetime already. And once again, I imagine that you have too. We live in a world full of paradox, don't we? So much variety, so much diversity, so many contradictions. I remember hearing a very sincere prayer once at church. A man, who I liked very much, stood up and said, "Dear Father in heaven, we are so humbled to be the most chosen of thy people." Wait, what? Is it really humble to consider yourself more chosen than other people? That isn't very loving. Dang, I hate that. Wait, what? I feel hatred when someone I like expresses their sincere feelings of gratitude to their Creator? That isn't very loving either. Dang it, I want to be loving. That's right, I want to be loving. I have always wanted to be loving. Through all of these different paradoxical lives, through all of the various hats and masks that I have worn, I've come to recognize that it isn't very loving to be constantly judging other people, to constantly find them falling short of some ideal of perfection, to constantly focus on perceived failures and flaws. It isn't very loving to be constantly judging others or myself. How can I stop judging? How can I accept the obvious fact that life is full of messy paradox, which is actually quite perfect and beautiful exactly the way it is, exactly the way that God or nature or the universe has made it? The idea of God both fascinates and confuses me. So much of what I've learned about God over the years has sounded far-fetched, made up, fictional. I closed myself off to the possibility of God for a very long time. I thought it was stupid to believe in God, and whether I was willing to admit it or not, that meant that I thought people who believed in God were stupid too. Hang on, I'm doing it again, aren't I? It isn't very loving to be constantly judging other people. Dang it, I want to be loving. Can I rewire my brain to be less judgmental? Can I get rid of judgment altogether? Would God help me do this if I asked Him? Do I even believe in a God that would help me do this if I asked Him? What would something like that even look like? Bathing with God is a series of conversations I had with a voice that came to me when I was soaking in a bathtub. That voice was not audible. It was imagined. That voice was not foreign to me. It was familiar. That voice became my friend. It had always been my friend. And it responded when I asked it to. It answered the call to help me become more accepting and less judgmental of both myself and others. In this book, you as the reader have been given a ringside seat to my inner paradox, my consistencies and inconsistencies, my attempts to use my own imagination to look at the world through the eyes of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God. A God that does not strike down thieves before they steal. A God that does not strike down abusers before they abuse. A God that seems to love, nourish, and sustain all people, allowing everyone to float in their own particular sea of paradox. A God that both fascinates and confuses me. A God that has been teaching me, through my own imagination, how to be a more loving, accepting, joyful human being. And you know what? I think it's working, because I can say this with all honesty. I do not know who you are or where you come from, dear listener. I do not know what you have done, what you will do, or any of the specific paradoxes that define who you are. But I know for a fact that I love you. I know that any judgment I might ever put on you or on anyone else is only a projection of those parts of myself that are still in search of acceptance and love. In other words, if I judge you, it's not you, it's me. Those are the parts of myself that still focus on failure and have not yet learned how to let go of fear, that have not yet come to fully understand what it truly means to be constantly, inescapably bathing with God. So, welcome to my mind. Welcome to my heart. I wrote this book for me. I'm sharing it with you. It is meant to be enjoyed, so I hope that you enjoy it. Glenn Ostlund, August 2020. P.S. My full name is Dow Glenn Ostlund II. That means that my initials are DGO, which can be arranged to spell either God or dog. So if you decide to call this book Bathing with Dog, I will completely understand, and I promise not to judge you for it. Introduction. Atheism. There is no God, I often say. How could there be? There is no way. There is no Christ. He gave no gift. His so-called teachings, ancient myth. And while I'm on the subject, please, I have no arms, no legs, no knees. There is no God, no heavenly place. It's as plain as the nose that's not on my face. There is no God. How could there be? There is no God. There is no me. Glenn Ostlund.
Why did you start with that poem?
What? Who are you?
You know exactly who I am, and we'll get to that more later. But this is the introduction to a book called Bathing with God. So why did you start with a poem called Atheism?
'Cause I like it.
I like it too. I'm the one who wrote it, you know.
No, you didn't. I did. When I was a 15-year-old sophomore in high school, as a way to send a message to my atheist English teacher.
What message were you trying to send?
That a denial of God was the same thing as a denial of self.
Have you always felt that way?
No, but I sure did back then.
You turned in another poem as part of that assignment. Do you remember?
Yes, I remember.
Why didn't you choose that one for this book?
Because it was about a zit.
Yeah, I really liked that one too. Let's hear it.
Okay, here you go. Life as a zit. Where would I be if I were a zit? Would I be on your face or on where you sit? Would I be in your nostril, inside of your ear, in your mouth, on your tongue? Just look in the mirror. I could grow on your chin with a head white as snow, and where you don't wash is where I will grow. Oh, the fun it would be. There's no way that I'd stop. That is, till you'd find me and give me a pop.
Nice. And what message were you trying to send with that one?
That I thought the assignment was stupid. That I could write poems standing on my head. And that poems didn't have to be about lofty, beautiful ideas. But why do you care? Who are you, anyway?
We'll get to that soon enough. For now, why not tell these beautiful people what they're in for with this book?
What people?
The people who are either reading or listening to these words right now.
There are no people reading or listening to these words right now.
Not your right now, their right now. In your right now, you are writing the words that come from somewhere deep within you, and you're currently all alone, soaking in a bathtub, writing this on your phone with your right thumb. But trust me, eventually there will be people paying attention to this, and in their right now, they're wondering what they're getting themselves into, and whether this is the kind of thing they'll want to spend any time on. So, let them know what they're in for.
Okay, I was raised to believe in God. I believed for a long time. I even spent 2 years in Japan going door to door as a missionary for my church, trying to convert people to believe in God, or at least the version of God that I believed in at the time.
But then something happened, right?
Yeah, I went to graduate school.
And what happened in graduate school?
I stopped believing in God.
Why?
Because I was studying folklore and mythology, and I realized that all the stories in the Bible are just stories. Legends, myths, folk tales. They're fictions, not actual history, which is what I believed when I was a kid. There was no real Noah who put all those animals on a boat. No actual Adam and Eve with their talking snake. No 6,000-year-old Earth. Just a bunch of stories that, true, have helped a lot of people in a lot of different ways, but they've hurt people in a lot of different ways too. So I stopped believing that any of it was real.
And then what happened?
I eventually realized that all stories have a very real impact on people, whether the stories are true or not, which means that fictions always have some element of truth to them, even if that truth is nothing more than what we learn about ourselves when describing what we see, like an Rorschach ink blot. I then spent a lot of time asking myself a lot of deep questions. Eventually, I realized that most of them simply cannot be answered. At that point, since I could find no definitive evidence either way, it seemed foolish and almost hypocritical for me to be so certain that there was no God. That shift in perspective fundamentally changed the way I see myself and everything else around me, and those changes made me want to write this book.
I remember. I was there. So, what kinds of deep questions did you ask?
Well, there were a lot of them, like, who or what am I? And why am I here? Do I really have more atoms in my body than there are stars in the sky? Is each atom a tiny bundle of energy that was made in the stars? Am I actually a being of energy? What is the relationship between energy and matter? Which religion is right? Are any of them right? What does it even mean for a religion to be right? Are religion and science really enemies? Is there any way to bring them closer together, even if it's just within my own mind? What is truth? What is fiction? Can truths be fictions? Can fictions be truths? How much do we really know compared to how much we really don't? What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of perception? Is there a difference between the way I perceive reality and the reality that I cannot perceive? How has evolution determined the way I perceive reality? Aside from the 5 physical senses, do I have any other senses that influence my perception of reality? A sense of equilibrium, a sense of time and place, a sense of humor, a sense of self? What role does imagination play in turning these senses into meaningful stories about the world around us? What is an ego or a personality? What is a soul? Is there a soul? Did we exist somehow in any form before we were born? Will we exist somehow in any form after we die? What role does evolution play in the development of my personality? Is there a similar type of evolution for a soul? How was all of this actually made? If atoms create molecules, and molecules create cells, and cells create the organs and tissues that make us up, what is the intelligence that instructs and directs each self-organizing bit of subatomic energy on how to become any one of those atoms in the first place? Is there some kind of energetic DNA behind our DNA? Is God just a story that parents have told their children for years and years and years? Or is there more to it than that? If so, is he a he? Or is she a she? Or does gender even mean anything to a divine creator of everything? What if God is nature? What if God is love? What if God is the subatomic energy that creates every atom, molecule, and cell in every living and non-living thing? What is the subatomic energy in the quantum realm? Is it really a single energy field that we're all connected to and created from? Is it intelligent? Is it conscious? Is it alive? Is it aware of all of the things it creates? Are any two of its creations identically the same? What if our intrinsic value in this universe is that I'm the only version of me that ever will be, and that you are the only version of you that ever will be, and that we are each beautifully different ways that subatomic energy creates new and infinitely expanding experiences for itself to experience? What if our eyes had evolved to be able to see the subatomic energy that is constantly creating and maintaining everything around us? Would it appear to us as a fluid, like water? Would it feel like we were constantly immersed in it? Like we were constantly bathing in it? What would it be like if I could communicate with this subatomic energy? What would I ask? What would it say? And how might the answers to any of these out-there questions help me, or anyone else for that matter, in any practical way in my everyday life?
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
Tell me about it. That's why I wrote this book.
Did you get any answers?
I got all the answers.
Really? Arrogant much?
Well, I got answers that have satisfied me, at least, for now. Other people will, of course, see things differently, because we're all looking at the world through very different filters based on our unique individual experiences, which is exactly the way it's supposed to be. That was actually one of my answers.
Nice. And how exactly did you get all these answers?
Keep reading and you'll find out.
Cool, I will. And hey, look at what you did. I'd say this is a pretty good introduction now. People who are interested in exploring these kinds of questions will want to read on, and people who aren't can focus on something more interesting to them. Nicely done. There's only one more thing that you should tell them.
What's that?
Make sure they know why you are doing this. What do you hope to get out of writing this book?
I don't really know. Why do you think I'm writing it?
For the same reason that you built sand castles when you were a kid. Because it's fun. Because you're surrounded by all of this sand to play in. All of these words, thoughts, and ideas. All of these neurological rhythms. You like putting things together to see how it feels to play with them. Well, that's it. You never built any of those sand castles as places to actually live in, did you? And you certainly never built any of them to last. When you finish this book, you will move on to another one.
I guess that's right. But why are you telling me this?
So that your readers will know that you're not preaching big capital T truths at them. That you're not attached to any of these ideas. That you're playing with these concepts and you're inviting your readers to play along with you. And that you certainly do not intend for any of this to be taken too seriously. Although you offer up every word with heartfelt respect and sincerity.
Is that supposed to be a nice way of saying that none of what I'm writing here is true?
Not exactly. There are certainly truths to be found in what you've written, but the greatest of those truths will be the unique responses that each reader will bring to what you're sharing with them. What it truly makes them think and how it truly makes them feel, regardless of what those thoughts or feelings might be. Now go ahead and wrap this up so we can get to the meat of this already.
Thank you. I think I will. Bathing with God is the book that I co-wrote with my imagination when I took the time to relax in a nice warm bath and explore possible answers to many of my favorite questions. Those answers came to me from somewhere deep within. As a result, some may consider this to be insightful, channeled writing, and it is. Others may consider this a work of fiction, and it is. As you will see in the pages that follow, I do not consider fiction and insightful channeled writing to be mutually exclusive ideas, because they aren't. And of course, neither does the massive sea of energy that is the creator of everything that exists. Every quark, every electron, every atom, every bioelectrochemical thought in our brains, there's nothing that is not an extension of this energy. Everything is a unique fraction of that whole. No unique fraction is anywhere close to the complete whole, and no fraction can perceive anything beyond the limits of its fractional ability to perceive, although perceptions can be changed, which will most likely be experienced by every reader of this book. It will most definitely change you. The question is, how? That answer is up to you. Don't worry. The energy that whispered these words into this book is not malicious. And it is certainly not a stranger. You've met her many times before. You're just as much a part of her as I am, and she expresses herself through you just as much as she expresses herself through me. All of these expressions are, of course, unique to our own biological makeup, environmental influences, cultural heritage, individual life choices, and many other variables. We are each a one-of-a-kind work of art, created and sustained by this energy. We are each a unique fingerprint on the universe, a complicated and ever-evolving aperture through which shines the mysterious energy from deep within each of the billions of atoms that make up our bodies. This energy shines through each of us in a dazzling variety of ways, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to the dazzling version that is presently shining through me. It is the source of life, it is the source of consciousness, it is what people call God, and all of us are constantly bathing in it. So come on in. The water is absolutely fine. Thank you for listening to Bathing with God. If you like what you just heard and would like to purchase a print or Kindle version of the complete book, search for it on Amazon.com or go to the website bathingwithgod.com. And if you really, really like what you just heard, share it with someone you love and give me a 5-star rating on iTunes or whatever podcasting platform you use. You can also like our Facebook page and subscribe to the Bathing with God YouTube channel. And if you'd like to reach out to me personally, you can email me, Glenn Ostlund, at bathingwithgod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. And probably so would Quad.
Oh yeah, bring it.
Thanks again for listening to Bathing with God.